Good morning, everyone. This is, again, if you happen to stumble on this randomly, my name is Dennis Misigoy, Libertarian running for the U.S. Senate here in the state of Florida. Excuse me. I need a drink of water. But live streaming again. Goodness. Here on November 30th. And just getting started, man. Good morning to everyone. I'm trying to think where I want to start today, and as much as it's not necessarily the sort of topic I usually want to go to, because it's not really policy per se, but talking about some of these trials, I thought just an interesting observation, and it wasn't my observation originally, over the last week, was from both because a little over a week ago we had the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict, the verdict in that case, and then the verdict in the Ahmaud Arbery case, where we had all three defendants guilty, rightfully so. I think anyone who watched the video, you'd have a real hard time coming away with any different assessment than that. And but something that I thought was interesting is just that the way that these cases have been framed and the people on each side of these cases have been framed, or at least in particular the way Rittenhouse was framed by the media, and certainly what I think was legitimately the scenario in the Ahmaud Arbery case. I just thought it was interesting following up to those, where we had in the aftermath of the Rittenhouse case, he did the interview with Tucker Carlson, and I think one of the sort of funny things that came out of it, and a response that sort of got mixed reaction from folks who had been backing him to that point, was when Kyle Rittenhouse mentioned that he supports Black Lives Matter. Now, I don't know at his age how well he understands in terms of the organization and some of the politics behind it, but I think in terms of the movement and the concept and the concept and idea of these sort of disparities, and he talked a little bit about how the prosecutors went after him and what they could have done to somebody who was perhaps in a little more vulnerable position than he was, in terms of both having the resources to defend himself, as well as also having the media attention. And so it's just interesting to hear him say, well, he supports Black Lives Matter. And then on the opposite side, you had after the verdict came out for the Arbery case, we had the father of Ahmaud Arbery, as in sort of a press conference or whatever afterwards, make statements that basically, and you can go find the clip of it, basically saying that all lives matter, and saying that this has to do with everybody. It's not just about one group versus another. And it really does sort of peel away a bit of a layer of how the media sort of presents these things to what is really there. And sort of, again, I think we need to get back to a recognition of the common humanity, who we are all together and in relation to one another. I'm a religious guy, so I go with the standpoint of we're all, sons and daughters of the same God in heaven. But even if you're not religious, I think a recognition of the common humanity, and not in the shallow sense of the way that the All Lives Matter phrase was just sort of a response to Black Lives Matter, but an actual recognition. Because if you say All Lives Matter, we should be talking about, like, what was it, Zemarai Ahmad and Ahmadi, I can't get the name right now, and his family, who were victims of that drone strike in Afghanistan, or, the weddings and hospitals that we've bombed, just sort of casually through the wars over the past bunch of years. We should be talking about those lives if you're really going to use phrases like that. So I think that's important. But I think that, but it was sort of interesting to see. And also, but I'll get back to it later, contrasting with the Ghislaine Maxwell trial that's now underway, which is obviously, we have kind of a media blackout at this point. This is obviously one that's really kind of being a bit more hush-hush. There's obviously some information that's getting out, but certainly it's not, that one's not being televised for many reasons. So let me get to a couple comments from Joe. Hey, how was Thanksgiving? Thanksgiving was good, man. Thanksgiving was good. I've got a good bit of my family just close by in the area, and very close by, really. I mean, that was part of why we ended up kind of moving over here. So, but good times. Fried a couple turkeys. Too much food that everybody else made. You know, it's the usual. It's the Thanksgiving thing, but good times. Good times. No, and when you talk about frying turkeys, you know, nothing really going wrong. About as smooth as it's ever gone in terms of, you know, no. I guess because the turkeys were probably a little bit smaller. I don't know if that's an inflation thing or not, but it's not a big deal for me. Usually, it can be excessive or has been excessive in the past. So, but we're good, man. And I hope, I hope everybody else watching this had a good Thanksgiving as well. It is funny, sort of, I guess, to kind of segue that into some of the political aspect, mentioning inflation, you know, is an interesting thing as, I don't know if this is where people use the term gaslighting. It's not a term that I typically use in my own, it's not a normal part of my own vocabulary, but I think it's sort of applicable when we talk about, you know, the sort of average person's experience, you know, and it's something that's been a part of libertarianism, really. The foundation of the party, at least, was kind of sparked by the U.S. getting off the gold standard. It began the same year, and in response to Nixon temporarily, don't forget it, suspending the convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold. Now, we're 50 years on, temporarily suspended. I wonder when they're planning to restore it, of course. And obviously, since that time, I think what the U.S. dollar was, or an ounce of gold was something around $35, $35 an ounce. Today is closer to $2,000. I haven't tracked the price of gold that closely within the last little bit, but obviously you can see the problem there. And gold is just one way of measuring it, but, you know, and that's maybe not front and center for most people day-to-day lives, and obviously 50 years is a decent span of time. So again, it's something where it happens progressively and people don't necessarily recognize it, but or they don't see it quite so plainly, but they are seeing it really plainly within the last year or so, because again, there's a lot of talk about the inflation on prices for foods that are common in and around Thanksgiving time. And I remember seeing quite a few news reports where they talked about this, and it's sort of funny, again, getting back to that term of gaslighting, to see the current administration, the Biden administration, sort of tell people and try to insist that all these economic markers are good, that everything's going great, and they've had all these economic successes. And I've seen a few articles say things like that. And anybody with two eyes to see just sort of says, what are you talking about? Because people are feeling it, people are seeing it, and it is part of why that this maybe should be something we really get to the heart of with folks, because as shallow as it may seem to talk about at times about economics and money, it really isn't, because and in particular talking about the value of the dollar, because number one, money is one half of every transaction. Everything we do, we either sell something, we get money in exchange, even if that's our day job and we're trading hours for dollars, just like I do, just like most of us who are working stiffs, or everything that you buy, everything you purchase, payments on your home, car, everything, every service you receive, everything. The dollar is one half of it here in the U.S., and so when the dollar is undermined, obviously it does tremendous harm to us. Salaries are always the last thing to keep up. Prices are the first thing to go up. And it's really interesting to see people sort of, you can't defund that, but it is an interesting sort of thing. And in particular, also seeing, I remember recently a few people piling onto, and rightfully so, piling onto Senator Elizabeth Warren over in Massachusetts, who, and I don't think she's the only one, but, you know, one of these folks going out saying that all this is happening because the corporations are so greedy and everybody's just trying to pocket all these profits. And while some people may be reaping greater profits, the sort of simplistic notion, again, that every bad thing that happens is a result of just somebody being greedy really doesn't grasp what's happening. And all you need to do is just ask, well, why are they so much more greedy this year than last year? What's the difference between then and now? And if you actually pay attention to what's happened with the dollar, and 30-40% at this point has been created within the last 24 months or less. Actually, really everything would have been after February of 2020, when really, and I guess really at the beginning of March, when everything got started rolling with COVID. So but what can we do about it? Well, government really shouldn't be, I guess, and this has, I guess, been a realization for me, and something that really wasn't always a possibility, or didn't ever seem like a possibility, which was that you could separate the money from government. I think all of us have grown up with this assumption that money needs to be tied to government, and I think that's one of the really nice things that cryptocurrency, and in particular Bitcoin, offers, where in the past I would have said, and I think if you stick to the Constitution, unfortunately the Constitution, I guess, limits us a little bit here, because Constitution gives the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof to the Congress, even though they've abdicated that responsibility to the Federal Reserve, which I think is also illegal and something that we can't do. We do need to end the Fed. They're at least the people who are regulating the value of money and creating it are at least directly accountable to the people by re-election, rather than being this abstracted layer away in the Federal Reserve, where they're kind of shielded and quite a bit more secretive and able to be more secretive. That's one step. Something else that could be done if we really wanted to go there and be a little more bold, staying within the realm of what the Constitution currently authorizes, you could have, there's no reason you cannot authorize an alternative currency that would be, we could authorize an alternative currency that would remain gold-backed, and if it's gold-backed, would retain the value, or at least retain its value relative to gold. Obviously, the value of gold can change, and there are factors that you cannot control when it comes to gold. If, shockingly, a massive gold reserve were suddenly found, that would impact the price of gold, and if the dollar were, or if a new currency were tied directly to gold, that would impact the value thereof. So there's pros and cons there, but I think that's also one of the things where, if you could, I think I have enough respect for the Constitution to say that I think you really would need to, if you wanted to just get money completely out of the hands of government, which at this point, I think, given the centuries of experience we have and knowledge, pretty much shows that we need to get money out of the hands of government. I think a great decision would be, if we could amend the Constitution to get to that point, would be to shift over to essentially a free market in currencies. You would probably end up with something along the lines of Bitcoin, where you'd have this kind of constraint on supply. One of the things I've thought about in recent times, and I keep meaning to work it into speeches, and I haven't done it because I keep not remembering at the right time, and I don't have it in my notes, or I just happen to skip over it in my notes when I'm doing it, is that every American deserves a dollar that is worth as much tomorrow as it was yesterday when they earned it. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be the dollar per se, but you understand what I'm saying. Today, any money I earn, if I try to save it for retirement, and that used to be the way people could do, that used to work. It's the responsible thing. It's a simple thing. Not everyone's a savvy investor. Not everyone is going to be, not everyone is going to have all these great ideas on things that they can do with their money. Now, you should, and particularly in the modern times, it is more necessary, but not all of us are, and particularly people come from working class backgrounds. that don't have that kind of insight or knowledge, maybe you can say it's incumbent upon them to acquire that knowledge and to put the work in. But reality has always been that people in the working class just haven't had that opportunity. And the simple thing that you would expect that they should be able to do, that they should be able to rely on, is say, well, I can't figure this stuff out, and I'm not trying to risk my money. I don't have enough to put it at risk. I simply want to save my money, be responsible, be frugal, put some of my money away so that tomorrow, when I need it, or when it's time for me to retire, or whenever it is, that I have this money that I can use. But when that money has lost 10, 20, 30% of its value over what it was when you started earning it, it creates a really bad situation, and it's unfortunate. And again, the people who are harmed the most are the people at the bottom. So at the bare minimum, what we should be able to have is people should at least have the option. They may not be forced to. If you had a free market in currencies, people could choose to use something else. That's again goes back to the idea of having a competing currency with the dollar, gold backed, under the gold backed, but still government authorized currency competing with the dollar. People would have a choice, so that people who want to have something that's tied to the value of gold, again, that comes with some risks, but we know what the risks are, or what the downside is to keeping our wealth in the Federal Reserve funny money, the fiat dollar. So we know what those are. We know there's the trade-offs there. So what do? We just give people the option. So that if someone just wants to save, if they want a dollar that will hold consistent value, they should have that option. So whether it is under the current options that we have under the U.S. Constitution, to have a competing currency also authorized by Congress that offers people the option of having something that is solid and backed by gold, or backed by something, so that it can't just be printed into oblivion or reproduced into oblivion, because right now we're talking just about dollars being created on computers, push of a button. They're not physically printing all those dollars. They're just moving it into people's accounts, and voila, there's more money. So either we can get that, or we can get government out of the currency issuing business altogether, and we can move to cryptocurrencies and things like that, where again you have a marketplace, you have options, and people can choose, and give people a choice. People should always have a choice, and certainly what you do with your wealth and what you put it in, I think right now, and what it has been for a long time, has been really a bait and switch, in particular with the working class folks who make enough to get by and maybe save a little. They don't have the bandwidth to maybe necessarily do a lot of the other things. They should have the option to say, hey, look, I just want to put my money somewhere where it'll be worth at least as much tomorrow, or I can at least reliably say the factors impacting it are very few. It's not just going to be arbitrarily impacted by a central planner's decision to say, well, we need more money because COVID, so we need to just inject $4 trillion into the money supply to help somebody. Obviously, we know who it helps is the folks who get the money first, before the marketplace has a chance to adjust in the value of it. As the money is in the system longer, that effect sort of trickles down to where prices start to increase on everything, and the money becomes worth less. And again, the salaries of regular people is the last thing to catch up. And it's just the way it is. It's the way it's always been. And unfortunately, it is what will continue as long as we have the monetary system that we have. So the best thing the government can do is at least offer people an alternative that is not going to be subject to this sort of fiat money central planning that is going to be tied down to the dollar, or tied down to some constraint that will limit how much can be created. The gold standard was something, but even if it's not necessarily the gold standard, if you have like what you have with Bitcoin, where you have a fixed where you have a fixed amount, or a fixed limit, I should say, that gives you something that can offer people a little bit more security in terms of that. So, with that said, I'm going to go back to, as I was mentioning about the trials, I thought, and again, I'm not the most, have the most in-depth knowledge to provide the most insight to it, but I think anyone, it may be just as a little bit of a microcosm of something else. But speaking about the Ghislaine Maxwell trial coming up, you know, it's sort of interesting to see this kind of secrecy pop up around the case. For anyone who's not familiar with it, this is connected to the Jeffrey Epstein case. She is a longtime friend, confidant, whatever, and heavily involved in everything that Epstein was accused of. I shouldn't just say accused of, was involved in, I should say, everything he was doing, which involved, sex trafficking, often with underage girls. So very, very salacious, and obviously also part of what really makes it the issue was that it's connected or interconnected with a lot of the ultra wealthy and elite. And so one of the things that is sort of so intriguing and indicative of how much trust we should put in the government, I think, is sort of how that whole case went down. Initially, the first time that Epstein was arrested, I think in the early 2000s, and he got off with a deal made available to him by a district attorney by the name of Alexander Acosta, who then surprisingly, out of nowhere, got a cabinet appointment in the Trump administration. Trump, who had been a friend of Epstein in the past. I know allegedly there was a falling out, or at least where Trump banned him from some of his properties. But it was sort of interesting that this guy who had given Epstein this deal under sort of questionable circumstances then had a cabinet appointment somewhat out of nowhere, and taken to the next step. Then when the Epstein case resurfaced, and that kind of resurfaced, I believe at that point Acosta resigned and kind of faded off into the shadows. At the same time, we had the specter of Epstein in federal custody, this case sort of going somewhere, and then suddenly we have, and this was always seemed very suspect to me, of course, a suicide attempt from a guy who had already beaten the system, a guy with a lot of wealth, where it's very questionable. It's one thing certainly to see a suicide attempt from a prisoner who is in a very disadvantaged position, or someone who doesn't see any way out. But it's difficult to imagine that from a guy, number one, who already beat the system and got away with it one time, and a guy who had that many connections and presumably that much leverage. So, but what's more than anything was the fact that this guy was, after one attempt, was on suicide watch 24/7. Again, in custody, under watchful, supposedly under watch 24/7, and yet somehow manages to commit suicide. Nobody stops him. Nobody sees it. Nobody stops it. Nobody sees it. And nobody's held accountable for the failure to do anything about it. That's really the kicker for me. Because even if you believe that everything even if you believe the official account of everything, the fact that no one is held accountable for the failure to do this one job of making sure that this guy makes it to trial, it should be a red flag. Now, obviously, the sort of obvious theory to put behind that is that, well, the folks who would have to hold somebody accountable didn't want this guy making it to trial, so you make of that what you will. I try not to infuse kind of my own theory too much onto it, everybody can draw their own conclusion. I think there's enough information out there to draw their own conclusion. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with this trial, and what is actually able to come out of it. But again, I do think the failure of anyone to stop and nobody's even put down as the fall guy, which is interesting. No one's even hung out to dry for the Epstein suicide that occurred. So, and it is unbelievable to the point where it becomes this long-standing meme, and not just a meme, I should say, but something that has been repeated, and rightfully so, I think, as an indication of both the sort of trustworthiness of the people in government, and really the willingness or the lengths that they're willing to go to protect themselves. So I think it's instructive, it's informational if nothing else, and it'll be interesting to see what is actually able to come out of the trial that's coming up now. So, but that's enough with trials. Let me think. We got a few more minutes at least. So, as we talk about, let me see, what area of policy? I mean, I guess, let me just come around to it as we're, as I was mentioning about how anyone with concern for innocent lives being lost, as we were talking about, that all lives matter hasn't typically been used as a rallying cry for that, rather than just as a be quiet sort of response to people calling out a particular situation. I do think it's worthwhile to, again, as often as I can, bring up the fact that in particular the race that I filed for here, the U.S. Senate seat for here in Florida in the 2022 election, the likely nominees from the Republican and Democrat Party are going to be two people who are consistent supporters of furthering the warfare state and enriching the military-industrial complex. Back in 1961, in January, we had the farewell address from President Eisenhower, which warned Americans about the potential harm coming from the influence of the military-industrial complex, and I think it's interesting just because in such a public venue or such a public format that we receive that warning as a nation. I wonder, is there anybody in the country who looks back at that and says, well, we've heeded that warning, we listened to President Eisenhower and that warning that he gave us about what could go wrong? And does anyone think that? I can't imagine. And maybe I do live in a little bit of a libertarian bubble in terms of political discussion, maybe, just possibly. But I don't know anybody who can credibly look at the last 60 years of American history and come to that conclusion to say that we have actually heeded that warning. Instead, I think obviously we've kind of gone in the opposite direction, and the Republican and Democrat likely nominees for this seat, that being the incumbent Marco Rubio and Congresswoman Val Demings, they are consistent supporters of this. Even again, and I've probably mentioned this on here before, but I will continue to mention it because it bears repeating. Even after leaving Afghanistan, even after ending this war in this country, which is obviously very a difficult one to fight in, it's not called the Graveyard of Empires for nothing. The longest war in American history, just ended this year, and yet still these folks are all on board to raise military spending again. And again, I should have it handy. I'm going to make sure I have it handy for the next time I do this. But if you go and look at the chart, it is absurd. When you compare U.S. military spending to the next 10 countries in the world, it's absurd. You've got more than the next 7 or 8 countries combined. Okay, people like to beat this drum and get afraid of China. China's a pittance, and it's not just how much money they spend. There's a myriad of other problems that they have there. They are not the strong economy people think. by comparison, and the fact that they are, again, sort of reaffirming, or at least the leadership there is sort of trying to reassert themselves into this sort of economic control, like actually getting back to communism on the economic side, is only going to do harm to them and is only going to make them weaker. But again, they're the second largest economy, but they've got triple the population we have. They're not in the same place that we are. They're not in a position to compete. So fear-mongering about that is very misguided, and fear-mongering really about anything at this point in the world is misguided. I forget what the stat was, but the U.S. has enough firepower to obliterate the planet something like 10 or 20 times over. So the idea that we need to just keep on increasing spending, and in particular when the Pentagon has demonstrated itself to be so irresponsible with American tax dollars and so opaque about how they spend it, it really is important for us to draw the line. And the only way that's going to happen is if we stop electing people into these positions who are just going to keep writing blank checks to these guys, who are just going to give them whatever they want. And that is what you will get with Senator Rubio or with Congresswoman Demings. You will get the same thing. Blank checks for the military-industrial complex to do whatever they want, and then some. And in particular, the last NDAA, which is what I'm referencing, it is just another example of that. And again, expansion of powers. We've got red flag laws for military personnel, and of course, nobody likes red flag laws more than Marco Rubio, even though Congresswoman Demings voted for this one, which has a red flag law attached to it. So for these reasons and many other, I think it's so important for folks to really get out of that comfort zone where you've been used to voting for one or the other party for so many years. And I ask you to please, and not just to vote, but also to step up and to get involved. I can't do this alone. I can only do so much, so need as much help as I can get. If you can support the campaign, do that. There's a link in the description for this video. If you're not able to do that and maybe just able to give some of your time, there's a form on the website to do that as well. But we all need to stand up and be willing to say that we don't want to continue to further an establishment that is so committed to distracting us, hiding information from us, causing division among us, causing conflict among us needlessly, and again, sort of bleeding us dry through these many different pathways of taxation and government spending, through inflation, which is again just a tax. It is a transfer of wealth from the people who are currently holding dollars to the people who are receiving the new dollars that are entering circulation. So in all of these things, it is so important for us to understand this, and if we recognize what's being done to us, we need to also recognize that we're in a position to take action to change this, to break this cycle. So it's on us to do it, and I'm here to try to do my part by stepping up to run as a candidate, but I need your help. So please, as you go off after listening to this, please consider and make some time to go ahead, visit the website, or I should say this way. No, I'm thrown off. I apologize. So, but I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you for tuning in and listening, and I will be back on Thursday, man. So stay good, and we'll talk again some more. Bye-bye.